Hello, everyone. I'm Rania Khalek, and this is Dispatches. Michael Vatikiotis has spent decades working in East Asia as a journalist, and now he's Asia director at the leading conflict resolution organization, Humanitarian Dialogue. While home remains Singapore, he also returned to his ancestors' homes in Egypt and Palestine to uncover the diverse communities that once existed there and examine his family's complex history and its relationships with the peoples of the Middle East, as well as with the colonial powers that ruled them. I'll discuss with him this history, as presented in his book, Lives Between Lines, as well as his expertise in East Asia and recent developments in Myanmar, China, and issues affecting the region as a whole, including the US-China Cold War. Michael, welcome.
Great to be here. Thank you, Rania.
So I'm really excited to have you on because there's so many different topics to talk about, but I guess the best way to start is to start with some of the topics in your recent book before we get into maybe some of the more exciting stuff about Myanmar and China. So Lives Between Lines, I just want to say I really enjoyed it, not only because of the content, but also you're a really engaging and fun writer to read. So I just wanted to throw that out there because it's not, always the case for everybody that they're able to kind of like write in a way that's actually fun and enjoyable. So kudos to you for that. But the theme of your book is, of course, the Levantine people. So for our listeners and viewers who aren't familiar with what that means, can you describe what the Levantine people means, who these people were, and how it relates to your own family?
Well, the Levantines were a group, I describe it as more of a milieu than a culture, and I think it's hard to define as a culture, but they were a group of people who lived in the Ottoman Empire from quite early on. You started to get foreigners coming into the Ottoman Empire and working in trade, in commerce, and peopling the ports and the cities of the Ottoman Empire, with the Ottomans not being terribly concerned about who they were, as long as they provided constructive, productive input into the economy and society. So they developed as a very freewheeling community, governing themselves to a large extent through what was called the millet system, irrespective of whether they were Muslim or Christian or Jewish. And so there was this tremendous sense of diversity, tolerance, and productivity and creativity.
And of course, when you talk about in the book, you present it as obviously something very personal to you because this is who your family was, basically. So can you talk a little bit about your own ancestors, why and how they arrived in the Middle East, and why they left Europe in the first place?
Well, the arresting thing about my family history, in a way, is that they were refugees from Europe to the Middle East. Well, I have to understand that in the mid-19th century, Europe wasn't a secure place for everybody. You had the establishment of the Italian kingdom, which was violent. You had, revolution and war across the continent, the Greek War of Independence earlier in the century. And this generated a great deal of instability and insecurity. And many Europeans found that going to the Middle East, going to the coast of the Levant, to Egypt, there were plenty of opportunities for work. They were welcomed with open arms. The building of the Suez Canal, which is how I start the book, in 1859, was an opportunity for people to go and work and to staff and to develop the commerce that grew alongside the Suez Canal. And you also had regimes, if you like, the Ottoman rulers of the era, who were very welcoming of foreign talent and expertise. And so this meant that people who were leaving as refugees from Europe were able to arrive in the Middle East and quickly establish themselves and actually grow and prosper.
And it's so ironic, isn't it, that the Muslim world, if we want to call it that, and specifically here the Middle East, was once the safe haven for people fleeing hardship or persecution from Europe, which, by the way, is something that I wasn't aware of until I was reading your book about it, or merely, of course, migrating for better opportunities, as you describe it. And they came, like you say, without requiring visas. And then a century or two later, there's this migration in the other direction, right? With people fleeing Libya, Egypt, Syria. and elsewhere in a desperate attempt to get to Europe. I mean, the irony is kind of astonishing in that sense.
And you know, also for my family, who by the 1950s, you know, at the end of this era of cosmopolitanism, as I call it, and the rise of the Arab-Israeli conflict, when Arab and Jew were in conflict with one another, and the rise of Arab nationalism, it suddenly became very difficult for these foreigners to continue residing in the Middle East. They ended up as refugees back in Europe. My grandfather, a Greek who had never set foot in Greece, who was born in Acre in Palestine and spent his whole life in Palestine working for the railways. He landed up in Greece in 1954, and he rather sort of sadly puts on his resume, "I'm a refugee." He was a Greek, but he was a refugee from Palestine.
Yeah, I mean that, and you know, that's, you describe how the indigenous people, of course, like you just mentioned, welcomed the Greeks, the Italians, the Jews from Europe, and others. But do you think they were ultimately, the indigenous people I'm talking about of the Middle East, do you think they were ultimately in a way betrayed, in a way, as the presence of these immigrants sort of helped imperial powers penetrate the region? And in some cases, at least for some people, they were sort of like appendages of imperialism. That's kind of the what I got from the way you described it.
Yeah, and this is something that made me feel very uncomfortable, frankly, because in a way, my family benefited both from the indigenous context and from the imperial context, which developed later on. I think my Italian family got to Egypt just ahead of the British Protectorate, about 30 years. My father's family in Palestine arrived, you know, before the British Mandate of Palestine. And so they were there before the colonial powers arrived. But what happened is that the colonial powers recognized that these foreigners who were working in the cosmopolitan Levantine context were very useful because they didn't quite belong to anybody, and they could be harnessed to the sort of colonial project. Many felt uncomfortable about that, but of course many also continued to profit. And so, yes, for me, it was a sad aspect of this that, you know, they were kind of caught in the middle. I mean, the title of the book, Lives Between the Lines, really sort of describes it. You know, they were caught in the middle of many of these emerging conflicts. And it's something that made me quite sad in the end.
Yeah, I mean, I always, of course, knew about the way that European powers after World War I, and of course World War II especially, had used different ethnic and minority groups, religious sects, whatever, the divide and conquer rule. It's typical of colonialism and imperialism across the Middle East, to kind of cultivate their own little like puppet areas. But I was never aware of this phenomenon with basically European refugees who were living in these places. And I guess that kind of feeds into the next question is why, although you've already kind of, alluded to it, but why did this Levantine phenomena come to an end? And how closely connected is it to the retreat of colonial powers from the Arab world?
Well, the colonial legacy in the Middle East, like in other parts of the world, was essentially conflict. And in the case of the Middle East, more or less perpetual conflict since the end of the colonial era. And one of the major problems was, of course, identity as well. Because as the colonial era ended, modern nations emerged. And of course, they adopted modern forms of nationalism. You know, in the Ottoman period, the nationalist ethic, so to speak, or thinking was very much more relaxed and less about identity and more about things like pay your taxes, you know, you're a first class or a second class citizen, and govern yourselves. It was very pragmatic. But when the colonial administration, you know, and the colonial powers introduced modern forms of nationalist thinking, and of course it was inescapable coming from Europe after the Second World War that these influences would sweep over the region. And so the new countries that emerged were more exclusive. Egypt, many of my family's family members, didn't want to leave Egypt, but at the same time, they didn't want to abandon the foreign nationalities that gave them protection and become Egyptian. And to some extent, those options were not offered to them either. In the case of Palestine, it was very, very tough for my father's family. They wanted to stay. But the Israeli administration that came in after 1948 wasn't going to offer non-Jews citizenship. And so, I think in the case of my father's family, they would have stayed if they'd been offered citizenship.
Right. One of the most interesting things that you describe in this conflict, specifically related to Palestine, actually, is this conflict over the Greek Orthodox Church in Jerusalem. So the role of this church isn't well known. It remains one of the sort of secrets of the conflict in Palestine, which has otherwise been reported in all of its many aspects. And I understand it's been there since the Muslim conquests. And it's the Greek Orthodox Church is one of the largest landowners in Greater Palestine. So the book was a way for you to learn about the church and your family's role in it, as well as its role in your family's history, and that in sort of enduring importance of Greek identity in Jerusalem. Did I get that right? Or do you want to elaborate on that a bit?
I mean, I would just correct you and say that the Greeks were there before anyone else. At least that's what they tell you. They go back to the very early years of the Christian era. And the establishment of the Church of the Holy Sepulchre under the Emperor Constantine. And so one of the interesting things in Voyages of Discovery for me was to discover to what extent the Greeks actually consider themselves to be very much part of the landscape. I mean, there is this kind of perhaps arrogant, but also perhaps factually accurate view that the Greeks were there long before anyone else, at least with things like organized religion. And this gives them a sort of sense of proprietary sort of identity when it comes to what they would call the Holy Land. And the Greek Orthodox Patriarchate in Jerusalem is a remarkable institution. It doesn't associate itself with the Greek state at all. It has a much, if you like, more ambitious identity, which is representing Christendom. They look down on the other religions. They consider themselves to be the primary church in the Christian world, and as a result, they feel very sort of secure and confident there. And as I point out in the book, they own a hell of a lot of land. As much as a third of the land in the modern state of Israel is owned by the Greek Church and leased on long leases. And the reason they acquired all this land was because many people tried to avoid paying taxes in the Ottoman era by gifting land to the church. Now, this is all a little bit of a historical relic because they have almost no power. Now, it's true that Jerusalem as a city attracts huge numbers of pilgrims. I think as many as 5 million pilgrims a year. And this is a big business, and it's an important source of revenue for Israel and for the city. And the Greek Orthodox Church plays an outsized role in that because they run the holy sites. As they have put it, they own the stones. And I think that makes it a very interesting story. As you hinted earlier, though, Rania, there is a conflict involved because, of course, with the gradual increase in power of the Orthodox Jewish community in Israel, they look at the city of Jerusalem and its different religions and its, if you like, ecumenical diversity as a threat. And they would like to see the city become completely owned and dominated by the Jewish community. And therefore, the Greek church is under threat. Parts of the Christian quarter are being bought up by extremist Jewish organizations like Ataret Kohamin. And this is causing a lot of anxiety, a lot of concern. It's divided the Greek church from the Palestinian Orthodox community, who blame the Greek church, I don't think completely in their fault, but they blame the church for selling the land to these extremist organizations. It's a complicated, small-scale dispute. It doesn't get as much attention as the land grabbing that goes on in East Jerusalem of Palestinian householders, but it's nonetheless actually lies at the core of Jerusalem's identity.
Yeah, it's really a fascinating issue. I mean, you could probably just write a book about just that one little conflict. I'm in Beirut right now, which I was telling you before we started recording, which has been, as we all know, fancifully described in the past as the Paris of the Middle East. But it certainly was, this cosmopolitan place where multiple identities overlapped. But of course, years of civil war and corrupt governance and foreign meddling. And I guess finally this sort of terminal economic collapse that I'm witnessing happen around me now have reduced this city to poverty, and much of the population, is eager to flee abroad. Every time I go to the airport these days, I'm like the only one who's planning on coming back. Everyone has like 10 suitcases with them. It's actually really sad to see. But, if the Levantines you wrote about were welcomed into this diverse and liberal Middle East where they could thrive, right, at a time of optimism, now it kind of seems like everywhere we look, we see only poverty and misery and refugee flows and, consequences of decades of foreign intervention, with Israel often at the tip of the spear, right, used by Western powers to undermine this region. But the point I'm getting at is, where there was once this tolerance that you described very beautifully in your book, now we saw, or at least in recent years and recent decades, we see the opposite. We see this rise of Wahhabism and sort of other versions of extremism, I guess. So why do you think things have changed so much in recent decades? I know that's a big question.
And there is no single answer. What is immensely saddening is the erosion of institutions. I mean, I can call them institutions, traditions, modalities that the Ottoman Empire perfected. I mean, there are some who would argue that they learnt this from the Greeks, but nonetheless, they perfected a system that allowed for the easygoing interaction and accommodation of difference, of different peoples and different religions. It is true that towards the end of the Ottoman Empire, there was an upsurge in intolerance, partly as a reaction to the colonial powers impinging on the Ottoman Empire, and the rise of the Wahhabis and extremist Islam, militant Islam in many parts of the Middle East and the Arabian Peninsula stemmed from that late period, where there was, a lot of divide and rule, as you pointed out earlier. The British turned the Hijazi Arabs against the Ottomans. And that this all started to sort of foment at the end of the 19th century and the beginning of the 20th century. The Ottomans survived until the 1920s. And in fact, the other irony here is that they had tried to reform. They had tried to modernize. But many of these forms of modernization, I think I point out there's this irony that as the empire tried to modernize, the people who had been subject to very little centralized control, they started to get upset, like the Hijazi Arabs. They said, well, we don't want to be controlled by a centralized system, where you have officials here closer to where we are, taxing us and conscripting us. And so there was an upsurge of, if you like, resistance to the Ottomans as they tried to modernize in the European mold. So it wasn't just about colonialism, it was about the whole idea of how do you administer territories, which went from this very easygoing, rather sort of relaxed Ottoman system to one that more closely resembled the modern European nation state. And that has sowed division. That has created identity politics. And it's, that's the simplest answer I can give from a historical perspective. Of course, we all know that the introduction of the Arab-Israeli conflict also sowed tremendous division in the region. I relate that my family, in particular my father, who was born in Palestine, he went to university in Egypt and wanted very much to stay in the region. He knew pretty much after 1948 there was just no future for outsiders. You had to belong to one of these communities or the other. There was no place for the foreigners.
Something I found fascinating in your book, given the events of recent years, is this anecdote you describe where Wahhabis attempted to raid Jordan, and one of your relatives, I can't remember if it was your grandfather or great-grandfather, was, had been in Jordan when this happened. It actually reminded me of ISIS. Can you just, I guess, tell us what happened? And if you have any thoughts to add to that, given what we've already talked about?
Well, it's an extension of what I was just describing. And my grandfather, who was the only English member of my family, was working at the time for St. John Philby, who was the resident in Transjordan, which was the area that the British set up, if you like, as the kind of surplus territory to the eastern Palestine,
Right.
and
One way to describe it.
as a way of accommodating the Arab tribes and their leaders, who they had kind of let down in the First World War. They had promised them kingdoms and states, but they'd also promised the Jews a homeland. So they were kind of, my grandfather was acutely conscious of the contradictions of this policy. And of course, this of course created a Wahhabi upsurge, because the great families, the Hashemites and the Sauds, became very unhappy with the British and their betrayals. And so it created disturbances. My grandfather was a secretary to the resident at the time in Amman, and there was a Wahhabi raid, quite a serious raid. I mean, there wasn't much to Jordan at the time, and he was more or less at the time tasked with helping to address the issue in security terms by calling in the Air Force. But it underscores the fragility of the region at that time, and also the extent to which some of the seeds were being sown of what we see today.
Yeah. And with the rise of just to, I guess, shift geographic locations for a moment, with the rise of nativism in the West, and these right-wing nationalist movements, is there anywhere today where you see similar safe havens of diversity and multiculturalism as had existed in Egypt and Palestine, in the Egypt and Palestine that you describe in your book? Is there any equivalent of this in, say, East Asia, where you live and work now?
Well, I do draw the comparison or the contrast, in a way, to the plural society, as we like to call it, that the Ottomans perfected, under the system of the millet administration, and also various ways in which foreign communities were allowed to settle and subsist and exist, with the plural society as it was developed in East Asia, which again was very much a colonial construct. It was the product of empire. The British and the Dutch in Indonesia and Burma and Malaya essentially created different communities, encouraged the development of different communities, some of them imported, some of them already there, and ensured that they didn't actually mix all that much, and they lived apart. But they lived, their coexistence was profitable, because there was no attempt to integrate them, no attempt at homogenization. They kept themselves separate, and this was encouraged by the colonial powers, and it led to a degree of tolerance. But it also sowed the seeds of problems later on. Again, when the modern nation state emerged, you have a single identity. You are a Malaysian citizen, you are a Burmese citizen, you are an Indonesian citizen. And the awkwardness with which these different ethnic communities were either able or unable to integrate, or encouraged or not encouraged to integrate, was very much the colonial legacy. I do think, though, that the plural society as it exists in East Asia today, Southeast Asia, generally still works. There is a kind of an assumption that communities have rights, that they can stay within their boundaries as long as they abide by laws, and are loyal to the country that they are citizens of. You can worship your own religion, you can have your own language, as long as you learn the national language as well. And so there's a sort of an accommodation, and it works quite well.
Yeah. So I guess Michael Vatikiotis, which I love saying your name, it's so much fun. If I guess we could pivot to Asia now, maybe we can turn to some of the subjects most recently in the news. I guess let's start with Myanmar. So Breakthrough News, which is the channel that you are on right now, of course, is a leftist outlet. And because so little is known, I think, about Myanmar for English speakers, it's difficult for us to know how to frame the recent coup and protests there. So Could you start out by maybe explaining why this coup happened, and what was the role of the West's, I guess, former darling Aung San Suu Kyi, and the role of the military, and I guess most importantly, which I think is what a lot of Western leftists are wondering, is there a foreign role here? Are outside powers like the U.S. or Europe or China or India involved at all in what's been happening in Myanmar?
Well, the history of the country suggests that, of course, this is not the first time that the military has taken over, but the long history since independence in 1948, 49 was essentially that the country sits between two of Asia's largest countries, or the world's largest countries, India and China. And this imparts to the Burmese a particular kind of resilience to the outside world. Isolation doesn't really worry them that much. They're used to being sandwiched between two giant neighbors and managing to survive. And against that backdrop, the world has been wringing its hands about the military takeover this time and the collapse of a legitimately elected government, twice, in fact, in 2015 and in 2019. And it has to be said, though, that for the ordinary people in Myanmar, the experience under the elected government from 2015 to 2019 wasn't as liberal as people assume it was. There were challenges of media freedom. The peace process with ethnic armed groups wasn't going well. Aung San Suu Kyi herself was a rather imperious leader, rather remote from her people. I don't think there was any ideology involved here. She just saw herself as the legitimate leader of her country, not just elected, but the daughter of the founding father, Aung San. And I think that no one, of course, welcomed the coup, because the larger issue for Burmese people, for the people of Myanmar, is essentially that they have been struggling against military rule and repression for, since 1962. And they had thought that, at last, after the election of 2000, well, after the semi-transition in 2011 and an election in 2015, that they could see light at the end of the tunnel. The military had not disappeared. They had a role in the parliament. They were, obviously in charge of security matters. There was an awkward relationship between the elected government and the military. But this takeover was really the last straw for many people. And that's why we see very determined resistance against the military. I stress it's not necessarily for love of the previous government that was elected. It is a determined resistance to military rule.
And, speaking of that resistance, you're talking about this protest movement that came out of or against this military rule very quickly evolved into what could, I think, be correctly classified as an effective insurgency. Now, is that also mainly indigenous, and what are its goals?
The problem with saying indigenous in the Myanmar context is that that's a loaded term because the majority Bama people like to consider themselves indigenous, and the ethnic minorities, they classify between those who may be indigenous or have lived there for a very long time, and those like the Muslim Rohingya, who they determine not to have lived there long enough. But I think it's fair to say that it's not really an effective insurgency against the military junta. It's just public anger and a refusal to cooperate and a refusal to concede that they're in power that is not always very well channeled or organized. There's a kind of a lack of leadership in terms of the democratic opposition in Myanmar. It's a bit scrappy. It is leading to more and more violence. And it's also complicated by this lattice work of civil wars that have been going on for the last 70 years involving the ethnic armed organizations. And so it's not easy to paint a black and white picture, and nor is it easy, I'm sorry to say, to imagine that the opposition has an easy pathway to successfully overturning the military, because they can play so much divide and rule.
Yeah. And it's also interesting, like I had asked, if there was foreign meddling in this, and it doesn't seem like there is so much. It seems like a lot of countries think their adversaries are involved in Myanmar, but it kind of also doesn't seem like any big country cares so much.
Well,
Except, go ahead.
Yeah, that's a very good question. And I think one can divide the answer into two parts. Everyone is concerned. And because, as I said, the Myanmar military is so accustomed to isolation, sanctions don't work, pressure doesn't work. There's a lot of frustration in the international community. And that includes the Chinese and the Japanese, as well as in the West, that they can't seem to be able to apply any pressure. There's no real leverage. I mean, there have been sanctions imposed. They are isolated, but they've survived that before, and they can survive it again. There is income derived from transnational crime, from drugs, from illicit products exported out of the country, cross-border trade. Up to about $70 billion a year can be earned
a lot of money.
from that. It's a lot of money. So at the same time, the ordinary people suffer. The what's left of the formal economy is in tatters. And I think, though, the other side of the coin is that the US-China, increasing US-China strategic competition or confrontation is also making it difficult for either China or the US to do anything that would confer an advantage on their opponent. And so it sort of cancels out the impact that they can have.
That's interesting that would actually cause like no side to be able to be constructive. Go ahead.
And in addition, in the Middle East, you have the emergence of proxies getting involved in conflicts such as in Syria or in Libya. You haven't really seen that. I mean, it's so difficult in Myanmar to, you can't have, like you have in parts of the Middle East, the Turks and the Emiratis and the Russians sending their proxy forces in to sort of fight a war. No, that's not happening. The Chinese essentially, are scared every time a mortar shell lands on their side of the border, and they just shut it down. There are rumors and reports of arms supplies coming from other countries, including China. I do believe that a lot of that is private enterprise. It's the arms bazaar is largely private when it comes to these insurgencies. Yes, India would like to have on the Western side, its borders secured, Bangladesh as well, and the Chinese too. But it's very difficult to sort of imagine the same kind of proxy, warfare that you have in the Middle East. It's hard to get, as you said, foreign meddling to the same extent that you see it in the Middle East.
And on a totally like unrelated note, but just, it's just like a fun little fact. Fun, I don't know if fun's the right word, but the actual prime minister designate in Lebanon, Najib Mikati, I think he just bought the entire like telecommunications network of Myanmar. That's how he made his billions.
So I heard it's either Telenor, the Norwegian, or he bought the Myanmar MMT or something. Yeah, I heard that.
Yeah. Well, that's how he made his money, actually. He made his money by like going into unstable countries and buying their telecommunications companies. But just a little, fun fact on the side. But you did briefly reference sanctions, and I think Myanmar, in some ways is actually kind of like a case study in the impact of sanctions in a way. Because, this is the theme, of course, that interests a lot of us, given the proclivity of the US, the West, to impose sanctions on countries of which it disapproves. So you mentioned sanctions didn't work in Myanmar, though. But did they work in the past, I guess is the question.
Well, there's two ways in which sanctions can be, if you like, circumvented. Either a particular country or group of countries simply doesn't recognize them. In this case, the Russians, for instance, have taken a huge, sought huge advantage in the fact that these sanctions have been imposed by promising the Myanmar regime that they will supply arms. They invited the coup leader General Min Aung Hlaing to Moscow a couple of months ago. And so, there are always loopholes to be found. And the other problem with sanctions, and I think this applies to the case in Myanmar, is that it does, if you freeze the accounts of these people in the US or globally, so much of their income is derived through informal means. I mentioned earlier the transnational crime, and so it's just very difficult to cut them completely off. So for those two reasons, given that there are always going to be people willing to evade those sanctions, and the sanctions themselves are not going to be terribly effective in a context like Myanmar, it is a very limited weapon, if you like.
Right. And of course, not to mention just the level of suffering it can cause to entire countries. You mentioned the Russians, and I do think it was interesting how they seemed so eager to visit Myanmar after the coup. And I'm curious, why do you think that is?
Well, I think Russia likes to take advantage of these situations, especially when it means that, the competing powers, whether it be China or the United States, will be put at a disadvantage. And I think it's a very simple rule of thumb with the Russians that they will always seek advantage from situations where others are disadvantaged at little cost to themselves. And so they have no real they don't have very much business or investment in this part in Southeast Asia, but if they can seek advantage, they will, and that's what they've done in the case of Myanmar. It's hard to understand that policy other than just opportunism.
Well, yeah, I guess the way I see it is it's kind of like just to piss off the West. It's just put it in very simple terms. Just a couple more things about Myanmar. And one thing is, you kind of referenced this a little bit, but Myanmar has been experiencing multiple insurgencies for decades, has it not?
It has, and these are the longest civil wars in the world. It makes the Syrian war look like a junior, a young puppy.
Wow, that's saying a lot.
And 70 years since independence. Now, a lot of the fighting in Southeast Asia with these insurgencies is it's not like Syria. It's not the leveling of whole cities and huge amounts of human despair and suffering, refugee flows, chemical weapons, and so on and so forth. It's a sort of a war of attrition to some extent. It has been for a very long time. You have well-organized armed groups, well-armed. They try to avoid head-on skirmishes or fights with the national army. The national army similarly likes to avoid those things too. And so over the years, they've ended up doing deals with one another. The war never ends, but if you like, commercial opportunities of holding territory and allowing goods to pass through it and levying tolls on it, that's been going on for years. And it's also fair to say that many of these areas, they don't exactly, they may say they want independence, but they don't really want independence. They wouldn't be able to govern themselves. They're trying to get a better deal. The formal demand now is federalism, for many of these groups. And the problem with federalism is that it's very much a Western concept. It's also, in the case of Myanmar, it's about creating states in which each state has a different language, a different ethnic group, although the majority Bama now live almost everywhere. And the closest parallel would be India, which is a country which is a union of different states, most of them defined by different ethnic groups and languages, and religions sometimes. So it's not really the Western model of federalism. So this is what they aspire to. And it's been in the last decade, it's been a long, drawn-out process of trying to agree on a dialogue process, by which they can reach a settlement on this issue. And there hasn't been a lot of fighting. The danger now is that with the army takeover in Myanmar and with the deterioration of their authority over many of these areas, fighting will break out, not just because the ethnic groups will fight the central government, but because Bama people wanting to fight the central government will go to these areas, and they've already started setting up armed groups, People's Defense Forces, and also they will start to fight among themselves. to win territory, to compete with one another. And so, yes, there is the threat of greater conflict now in these areas because of the coup that happened in February.
And, this is not necessarily related to, well, it's not related really at all to the military coup, but the issue of the Rohingya, which had been getting attention in recent years, it's not a very clear topic. Like it's kind of like presented in a very vague way in the Western press. But what is the issue around that? And also, the one thing that I did see about that issue that I was kind of like, oh, that's not good, is there is a very small armed group among the Rohingya that's like their leadership is based in Saudi Arabia, which I found a bit odd. So there's this obviously huge humanitarian problem going on, lots of like xenophobia and attempts at ethnic cleansing, but then also like a potential for insurgency that's taking orders from people in Saudi Arabia. I don't know if I have that right or not, but what is actually happening with that issue? And is it still an issue with the military coup? Has that made it worse or better, or does it really not matter? It's the same as it was before.
I mean, the 800,000 Rohingya who were forced to flee to Bangladesh in 2016, 17, one of the largest, most recent refugee tragedies, because it happened so quickly with so many people. And they all ended up in these awful camps in Bangladesh, and very little effort has been made, despite promises by Myanmar, even under the elected government of Aung San Suu Kyi, to begin a repatriation process. No progress was made at all. And these people look as if they will never really ever be able to leave the squalid conditions they live in Bangladesh. Many of them are trying to get on boats. Many of them die in the process. It's a very, very sad story. I wouldn't overplay the emergence of an insurgency. I mean, yes, groups have tried to emerge. There was some attacks, which in fact prompted the initial exodus. But it's a very small, very ineffective and disorganized insurgency that, like many of these kinds of things, has descended into banditry and thuggery in the camps themselves, extortion and so on. So that's not a very good story. But the bigger story, which is again rather obscured by events, larger events, is actually Rakhine State itself has actually been taken over by another insurgency called the Arakan Army, a Buddhist insurgency that has, in a very short period of time, 2 years or less, managed to gain control of almost the entire state in the name of the Rakhine Buddhist people, who are obviously the majority in the state, and who don't like the Burmese either. And so it's a very complicated story, and their relationship with the Rohingya, at least what they would tell me, is that, oh, we're quite happy to have many of them come back. That's not a problem for us. But the fact is that the whole source of this problem, again, goes back to the colonial legacy and the British obsession with classification. Myanmar is a good example. Malaysia is another, where you have to be classified according to your race, according to your religion, and this determines your sort of place in society. And it's the saddest thing, because going back to what I was saying about the Ottomans were happy to do that too, but they let people live. They just let them govern themselves. They weren't really worried about imposing too much control. The danger you have is when you're insisting on classification and people living as groups in certain areas, is you're still imposing control on them, and it causes friction and it causes conflict. And identity in the larger context of Southeast Asia, whether it's religious identity or ethnic identity, has become more and more of a problem as, ironically, systems have become more democratic, so people can organize and voice out the demands of their community. And we see this in the largest country in the region, Indonesia, where over the last 20 years, the view of Islam, of Muslims, those who want Indonesia to be defined an Islamic state, has grown stronger and louder simply because they have the freedom to do so, the freedom to organize and to demonstrate. And it's very hard for the government, as they used to do, to crack down and put them in jail. So this identity politics issue has become a much larger problem for the whole region.
Yeah, I mean, I definitely know that's the case in the Middle East. So, identity politics, scourge of everything. I guess, just to wrap on Myanmar, how do you expect this conflict to resolve itself? Or can it resolve itself anytime soon?
I guess my answer would be, I don't think it's anytime soon. It hasn't been anytime soon for the last 70 years. We've had periods of relative stability, relative coexistence, even relative periods of relative democracy. But they really never had or never been able to implement a proper vision of the country as a unified, integrated, democratic whole. And that's a sad reality.
So I guess moving to an equally controversial subject, or more, actually, I shouldn't say equally. I think it's a more controversial subject these days, given the new Cold War tensions that are growing each day. China. Let's talk about China. And in the tradition of being controversial, we can start with the most controversial topic, at least in the West, related to China, which I think would be the issue of Xinjiang. So let's start there. I'm curious, what your thoughts are on what's happening with the Uyghurs in Xinjiang. You no doubt, as we all have seen these reports in Western media of, genocide and concentration camps and mass rapes, and there's millions of dead and just like horrifying claims of true. Yet, seemingly always made without any real hard evidence. And of course, there's some holes. And this is also happening, with the backdrop of a Cold War where, of course, everybody's going to embellish every accusation against the other side. So with all that in mind, what do you think is actually happening in this area?
Well, I mean, the short answer is none of us really know all that much because, as you point out, a lot of these claims are made without too much evidence and without access to the area by reporters. I mean, a few have got there. And I know for a fact that the area is highly policed, very, very high levels of security. Very difficult for people just to go there without being closely monitored all the time. Even people who are doing other jobs than journalism as foreigners will be so closely followed and monitored as to be, it's almost impossible to get any view, really. And so I think the first thing to say is we don't really know. And we hear reports from the Chinese that it's just a question of education. It's just a question of addressing security threats, hundreds or thousands of attacks that have been alleged to have taken place against by militant Muslims from Xinjiang, and this is merely an effort to address that issue. On the other side, as you heard, the accusations are getting bigger and bigger in terms of cultural genocide. One thing it does strike me is very difficult, which is China is one of the most homogeneous societies for a large country anywhere in the world. And they don't really deal with difference well. And the Uyghurs are a Turkic people, irrespective of being Muslim. They're not Han Chinese. And I think it's always been difficult for them to deal with that. They would rather they become Han Chinese. And so I think what we have seen, which is sad, are efforts to essentially try to emasculate, extinguish to some extent, the local culture. Because it's just too difficult for them, the Han Chinese, to accept. And that is sad. But I don't think that means that the other allegations about that are made about the numbers of people killed and and so on and so forth need to be accepted without some rigorous checking. And I do fear that the Uyghur issue in Xinjiang has become a football in the geopolitical contest, and we don't really see, and it would be in China's interest to actually let a lot more people go there and see what's going on. Having said that, if you look at what's happening in Hong Kong, it does become difficult to see a more benevolent, or see things through a more benevolent lens with regards to how the Chinese authorities deal with dissent. And we are obviously looking at a situation across China. Let's not forget the rest of the country, where the political environment is growing more and more restricted and harder and harder. And I suppose that, that's for me the bigger story in a way is the changes that are taking place in China itself under the leadership of Xi Jinping are making it very difficult for people to engage in the kinds of dialogue and discussion that one used to be able to have even just 2 or 3 years ago. And so it's going to be harder and harder to identify exactly what's going on.
It's interesting because obviously, you do see these accusations from each side. And then I hear different stories from people who are there, who insist no, it's not as bad as everybody says. And that, you do see videos coming out of Xinjiang. Obviously there's still mosques there. Obviously Uyghurs are, their culture still exists for the moment, at least. If, based on at least video footage of them dancing and doing traditional things. But then there's these wild accusations, and it is difficult also just to see it in any other context but this Cold War sort of atmosphere, right? So that said, with what you mentioned with these attacks in China by extremists, I back in the early 2000s, China did make overtures to George Bush when he initiated his war on terror, but they were rebuffed. And so is it very fair in a way to view China's operations, whatever the exact details of them might be, as a kind of war on terror in China?
It's their version of it. But I mean, me personally, I can't help but compare with the other global war on terror, Iraq, Syria, the use of drone missiles in Afghanistan, the numbers, the sheer numbers, almost uncountable numbers of people who've been killed in the name of the war on terror. Mm-hmm. I'm sorry, there is no comparison.
Of course. One was a global killing spree. There's no other way to describe it but a global killing spree that literally destroyed entire countries and regions. But, China also has this history of examples of homegrown religious extremism leading to conflicts with millions of dead, right? Could this be one reason why the Chinese authorities might fear the rise of extremist movements? Not to mention, of course, on top of that, this, I think, very real threat based on historical examples of the U.S. encouraging separatism to really balkanize its perceived enemies. And of course, China's one of them.
Well, of course, the China is well aware that there was an attempt by the Americans in the 1950s to encourage Tibet to break away. There was actual physical involvement. I don't think we see any evidence of that kind of interference in Xinjiang. But I think it's correct to characterize it very much as you did earlier. It's very much part of the war of words and rhetoric. Now I notice that news sites in the United States and the UK go out of their way to highlight some story from that part of the world, no matter how big or small, or no matter how small. So there's clearly an effort to shine a light on this issue, irrespective of how big an issue it is. And I think that that's very much part of the rhetorical Cold War situation we're in. And I think China has done the same thing with Black Lives Matter. Has highlighted that the way that blacks are treated in the United States, and they've tried. It's very much tit for tat.
And it behooves them to do that, right? To be able to point at the moralizing, lecturing U.S. and say, well, look how you treat your minorities.
And we're going to see much more of this. It's going to become a much bigger part of because the U.S.-China contest is going to become a bigger part of our lives wherever we are. We're going to see that happen more and more. And it's not necessarily telling us very much about the real situation, as we've learned from other parts of the world. And that's for me as a writer and a journalist and someone who preaches dialogue and impartial mediation. It's very, very sad when you really are prevented from, looking at the real situation and figuring out what to do about it because of the weight of this accusatory rhetoric, and also the absence of evidence, or the lack of a desire for evidence in any of these situations. I mean, it's also fair to say that in the global war on terror, the killing, what you described, the killing spree, there's almost no effort to look back on this now and do an accounting. We've sort of put it past us. We see it now in Afghanistan, where we're so worried about the position of women and what the Taliban will do, we've forgotten what about the killing that the coalition did in the 20 years before. And so it's just, we just put this out of sight, out of mind, and it's very unhealthy.
You mentioned Tibet, and it's also a popular cause in the West, as you know, and the Dalai Lama is sort of like revered as some kind of wise elder. But something about this looks kind of like a scam, at least to me. Can Tibet be seen as like a feudal society with a deeply oppressive religious hierarchy that struggled against the attempts of the Chinese to modernize?
I think that's right. My experience is, in a way, of Tibetans is that they're very hierarchical, very exclusive, that the religion imposes a great deal of encumbrance on the way people live, and yet that doesn't jive with the image that you have in the West of these sort of happy, peaceful people who are just being put upon. Having said that, I think it's a very unattended and largely little explored area of the world where, the historical boundaries that were set, make it very difficult to resolve these issues. And, whether you look at the whole of the Himalayan region, it is a little bit unstable, frankly. You have either countries that are completely dominated by India, or countries that are or areas that are completely dominated by China. And it's going to be very difficult for those countries to emerge as all those areas to develop some sort of autonomy, because it's a border area, essentially. It's the roof of the world, but it's also the border, or the zone that separates China and India. And we're seeing that today with the border disputes that the Chinese and Indians have come to blows on, if not outright warfare, but certainly come to blows, and are souring the relationship between India and China. Nepal swings between falling under the influence of India and falling under the influence of China. Little Bhutan manages somehow to sort of navigate this, I sense, by conceding to both countries. And the Tibetans and Tibetan culture sprinkled across that region. And I've always felt that the Tibetans, who themselves ran an empire, probably feel a little hard done by in that respect too, because they have a much broader cultural influence on this region than the current geographical boundaries of Tibet suggest.
So just a few more questions, I promise. I know I've taken up a lot of your time, but I really appreciate the time you're giving me. I wanted to ask you what is probably not going to seem like that big of a question for you, and maybe the circles you're in, but it's a point of heated debate on the Western left. And that is about what China's political economy actually is. Now, I mean, of course, as a leftist myself, I tend to be, sympathetic to the Chinese economic model in the sense that I do think it's a version of a socialist model, but other people do disagree. So I'm curious what your thoughts are. If you had to classify China, would you say it's capitalist, it's communist, it's collectivist, individualist, or socialist? How would you describe its political economy and culture from your experiences in China and I guess dealing with Chinese officials?
It's a really excellent question. It's particularly important to say that I'm going to answer it based on my experiences rather than, I'm not a China scholar as such. I'm a scholar of Southeast Asia. I think there's two things. First of all, ideology has become, like everything else because of the US-China contest or conflict, a much bigger part of this discussion. We saw the rhetoric of the Trump administration in its final years as the evil Chinese Communist Party. And I attended several meetings between US and China participants in China, before the pandemic hit, where it was clear that ideological contestation was becoming a much bigger part of the discourse between the US and China than it had been in many, many years. Because let's face it, China, as the emerging largest economy in the world, was seen as a boon for business. You had to go and invest there. You had to have people there. You had to be in a Chinese university. All of a sudden, suddenly it became all about the Chinese Communist Party values that are, that are not congruent with ours. And I guess what we saw in the last 5 years is this kind of emerging disappointment that, we thought that China was going to become more like us, but no, they're not. And we were fooled. We were fooled. And now they're stealing all our technology. So that's, I think, a very naive approach. But to your other part of your question about individualism, my view is rather, could be seen as rather radical based on my experience, which is that, we in the West, we're great believers in institutions. We tend to adhere to the values imparted by institutions. We don't call it ideology, but, we all went to schools. We all worked for companies with corporate values, and schools with codes and creeds. We belong to religions that impart values to us, and we believe in these institutions, or we respect these institutions. My experience in modern China is that it's very individualistic. They don't trust anyone.
Really?
They don't trust. They don't.
That's an interesting. That is a radical take.
They look after themselves and their families, and because there aren't many well-established institutions that have been allowed to sort of develop, it's reduced. Modern China is materialistic, and people want to excel and want to do well for themselves. And yes, of course, they serve the state, and they're often members of the Communist Party in order they can do better, and their careers will prosper. But I've always noticed this incredible sense of individualism. And it's also because in society, it's a very transactional society. You're constantly doing deals with individuals you're dealing with, to whether it's in business or in politics or in scholarship. And so I find them remarkably individualistic, even compared to Southeast Asia, where societies are often chained to whether it's ethnic or religious identity in a much more conformist groupthink way.
Interesting.
Yeah. So, and this is, I'm only talking about what I've seen of the China in the last decade, which has obviously been very materialistic. The economy's done incredibly well. And that's what's so jarring about what we see today, which is this imposition of a very, very strong, rigid, I suppose you would call it ideological, conformity. And I think it must be very difficult for many people who had really begun to enjoy that sense of individualism, getting ahead, succeeding for the sake of themselves and their families.
So if we could, this is actually interesting what you're saying, because I guess the way I had seen it was one of the reasons that I thought China had been so much more successful than a country like the US in dealing with something like COVID-19 is because they have perhaps a stronger centralized state, but I guess that doesn't necessarily mean institutions. But, if we can just, I guess, look at Asia as a whole for a moment, not just China, can you describe how various countries have handled the COVID-19 pandemic? China does appear to have, recovered and have grown after the economic crisis caused by COVID-19. But then its neighbors haven't fared as well, which is why I think it's interesting you mentioned the individualistic thing, because I guess I always assumed that China just had more of a collectivist model, which made it easier for them to implement sort of strategies where you need everybody to abide by certain mandates so that society doesn't get sick. But I guess, how would you say it fares against its neighbors in terms of COVID-19 and why? And do you expect more broadly a big economic decline as a result of this? And will that come with political and or social consequences in the region?
Well, I think one shouldn't confuse individualism with control. There's a
Mm.
great deal of control down to the neighborhood level, down to the building level in China, where, you know, if you wanted to leave that building, you wouldn't be able to, because there would be a neighborhood committee that would prevent you from doing so. So, you know, that's very efficient levels of control and surveillance, which has actually helped, I think, the Chinese
With the COVID-19,
with the COVID-19. I mean, you know, when there's an
Right.
outbreak in a city, everyone gets tested. Everyone.
Yeah.
You know, they're willing to spend on that level of mitigation and control. You know, and what we see in Western countries is, you know, you don't have that. You know, people are resisting mitigation. They're resisting,
Yeah.
you know, vaccinations. You know, now in the rest of Asia, you know, we've seen tremendous problems in Japan, where, of course, the Japanese constitution after the Second World War makes it very difficult for the government to tell its people what to do. You know, that was the legacy of the Second World War, is Japanese no longer want to be told by their governments how to live or what to do.
Right.
In other parts of Southeast Asia, there was a very high degree both of concern, anxiety, and a desire for governments, a willingness to have governments impose very high levels of control, because they just didn't want to get sick and die. And, you know, that's a complete contrast to what we've seen in the United States and in parts of Europe, where they've resisted those government efforts to impose strong mitigation, you know, measures. So, you know, culture and politics has a lot to do with it. I mean, one of my friends in Southeast Asia said to me the other day that, you know, one of the biggest problems, ironically, in many of these countries in Southeast Asia is that governments are afraid of their own people. You know, because people take public health so seriously. You know, there's a great deal of anger, a great deal of concern about whether the government has done enough to protect them. Similarly, you know, we're going to see a backlash against the economic cost of COVID as well, because in many of these countries, small and medium-sized businesses particularly have just completely disappeared. You know, this is a part of the world that relies on service, tourism, service economy, consumption. I mean, these are all areas that have been badly hit, not industry. I mean, exports are up again. So I think Asia the reflection will have to be that Asia suffered particularly badly because of the pandemic, because people demanded controls. The controls were invasive, pervasive, and they really brought the economies to a halt.
You know, yeah, it's so fascinating to compare it to the US, because actually, you know, the US had a lot of the same, despite having very few restrictions. I mean, there was like a lockdown initially in the US, but it wasn't even really a lockdown, right? It was left up to the states. And the US, despite like not having huge lockdowns like maybe other places in the world did, still, like you said, medium-sized and small businesses were just like eviscerated in the US. You can't last. But I guess the US is more resilient to a degree because it's not based entirely like on tourism as in terms of its like economy, like some of these other places are. But you know, in the Mediterranean, just turning to a little bit of a different topic real quick, in the Mediterranean, the US, Europe, it's been a summer of, you know, wildfires and really horrible floods. But like little is reported about climate change in your area of operations. Like we hear a lot about it in the West, in the Middle East, in Europe, but not where, you know, in East Asia. So have you seen significant changes in terms of climate change? Like what are the impacts and what do you expect the consequences will be for the societies there?
Significant and huge, because of course, whenever you're talking about Asia, you're talking about much bigger populations. And therefore the impact on people will be greater. And of course, the twin problems we're dealing with in Asia are rising sea levels and perhaps more importantly, rising temperatures. Rising temperatures in an area of the world that is already subject to an average daily temperature of between 28 and 32 degrees Celsius means that it will soon become very difficult in some areas to live and work outside, for instance. I mean, what we've seen, I've read reports about the situation in Baghdad over the last summer or so, where temperatures get up over
Brutal.
over
Yeah.
55 degrees. That's the future of some parts of Asia as well, not to mention drought and not to mention rising sea levels. You don't have the same forest fire issue because it's a very humid part of the world. You don't have that. In many parts of Greece this summer, the pine trees that went up was dry pine trees with resin.
Mm-hmm.
It's like jet fuel, and similarly, you don't have the storm behavior that you've seen in North America and Europe, because you have cyclones and tropical depressions in Asia, but that's the norm. And so far, those haven't been. I mean, there's been some superstorms, but not necessarily related to climate change. So you have different impacts, but overall, what I would say is that the impact will be huge because people will have to move, and you're dealing here with millions of people. What I think will happen across the Asia landscape is that people will move from south to north. They will head for the hills, literally. And that means countries like India and China will have severe problems of in-migration from people who've populated the countries further south, and will be heading north because it's cooler.
Mm-hmm. That'll definitely have repercussions in terms of politics, as we've seen it does in pretty much all of the world. And then I guess, getting closer to the end here, why does it seem like conflict between the US and China is inevitable? And to add to that, do the Chinese, in your experience, view the US in the same sort of cartoonish and menacing way that US media and politicians portray the Chinese?
Well, to answer the first part of your question, I think yes, inevitably, I think there will be a conflict between the US and China at some point soon. It may be a limited conflict. It may occur in the South China Sea. God help us if it occurs over Taiwan. But there is definitely a mood in the US defense establishment at this point. We might as well have a conflict with China now rather than later, because later on we definitely won't win, given the level of technology and development of military prowess that China is acquiring. But in terms of the perception of one another, it's a really good question and difficult to answer briefly. I think that for the US, what has been drummed up is a sense of a threat to primacy and to American values, which are predicated on primacy. We're the greatest country in the world. And I think China has been identified as a threat to that because it's simply the largest economy in the world now. And it's not so much about the Chinese people, because as I said earlier, the vilification is of the Chinese Communist Party. They're quite careful in US policy circles to distinguish between the Chinese people and the Chinese Communist Party, as if it were a thing. And then on the Chinese side, I think there's a great deal of disappointment and anger. Until just very recently, many Chinese families aspired to send their children to school in the United States. I mean, it was a high quality education. They would get all that education, come back and do well in China, or even maybe not come back. So there was, at a popular level, there was absolutely no problem at all with the United States, and no conception of a sort of cartoon-like, figures of Americans. In fact, they were embraced, and it was seen as a place where you would go and get a high-value education. Now that's not happening anymore. Visas are not being issued. Chinese students are suspect in the United States of being a security threat, and so on and so forth. So it's a bit sad because on the Chinese side, there was always this, and I believe that what China is doing in terms of becoming a global power, the only real example they have as to how to do that is the United States. The playbook was written by the United States in the post-World War era. No one else has done that. And I think, for the Chinese now, it's very difficult because there are things they clearly admire, they clearly respect about the United States as a power that has successfully wielded power. Both countries are now edging towards the same views on extraterritoriality. The US feels it can extend its laws globally, and China's talking about the same thing. Why not? That's what a global power does.
It's interesting the way you describe the sort of like Chinese disappointment. That reminds me so much of other countries that the US has started wars with. I'm talking more about the Middle East because that's like the kinds of people I'm familiar with and sort of like the attitudes of societies that I'm familiar with. But yeah, like Syrians never hated Americans, even though, the US was sanctioning Syria even before the last decade of civil war that the US played a huge role in making worse. And the same goes for, Iraqis and the same goes for people in Latin America, too, in countries that are sort of targets of the State Department. Is people, they actually don't have this cartoon view of America until the Americans sort of force them to because of their behavior as a government. But, maybe lastly, the one thing I'd want to end on is the last few decades of this kind of, I guess, American bullying, if you will, of sanctions and wars in the Middle East, and this kind of like weaponization of the dollar, really, which is what sanctions do, is they weaponize the dollar against these countries. It's convinced, I think, many countries, at least where I work, places like Lebanon, Syria, and Iraq, and then of course also with Iran, it's convinced them that they should be turning east, as they say. And they'll complain that, the West only offers sticks and no carrots. And they complain that US sanctions are destroying their economies. So my question for you is, do you think there can be an alternative based on closer financial, economic, and political cooperation between regions like the Middle East and China, or I guess Asia as a whole?
One way to answer that question is to highlight the difference between China and the United States. I mean, the United States is a country that was born of immigrants, tethered to Europe to some extent, culturally, religiously, has always had an open face to the world. China is an ancient empire, civilization, imperial system that suffered a huge shock towards the end of the 19th century, when this sort of sense of splendid isolation, was rudely interrupted by the European powers, from which, to some extent, they haven't quite recovered, what they call the 200 years of shame. But China is a rather insular country and society, and it's not going to be so easy for China to be seen as a source of much other than trade and technology and economic exchange. Because ultimately they're not like the Americans. They don't have a kind of missionary zeal, to impart values. I mean, there are those now in the United States who believe that they do, and so there's this whole sort of Red Star Rising group in the United States that talks about the huge threat that we're going to be if you don't go with us, the Americans. Chinese civilization will engulf you and force you to become like Chinese.
They'll force you to speak Chinese. They'll force you to learn Chinese.
I really don't see that. Not certainly in the lifetime of myself or my children. I think that it is a country that is awkwardly grappling with its power. It doesn't like to get involved too much. It's forced to. We'll see what happens over Afghanistan, where they're going to have a much bigger say and stake in a very difficult country. But their methods are different and in many ways less effective. I often say to my friends in Southeast Asia who are always asking, what does China think about Myanmar? What does China think about? I said, if you go to Beijing, they don't think about Southeast Asia. It's too far away. Up till recently, their only concern was Japan and Korea. Now it's the United States. So it really, yes, people will be looking east, and yes, they'll be looking for alternatives to the unreliability and quite frankly, the polarization of the United States, which actually makes them unreliable, because we for the first time, we don't know which way things are going to go. And so politically, and what that means for policy. And so, yes, people will be looking for alternatives. I guess the Iranians would like to see themselves as an option. They consider themselves another big, important civilization that the world has never quite recognized. And I think that as a whole in East Asia, there is a strong need for people to realize that actually their time has come. They can play a bigger, more responsible role in the world. This is something I'm always saying to my Indonesian friends. As a mid-sized power with a strong sense of nationhood, and a nationhood that's based on ideals and values, it's time for you to step up.
Yeah.
But of course, it's very difficult. The Western powers want to retain primacy, and they are very worried about losing it to the East. And the East is not prepared anyway. And so it's a difficult situation. There are no ready alternatives.
Well, Michael Vatikiotis, thank you so much for joining me and giving me so much of your time and breaking down stuff about your book and your experiences in these different parts of the world. I really appreciate it.
Thank you, Rania. It was my pleasure. Thank you so much.